pleasure to give this lecture. Thank you all for braving these impropitious circumstances to be present.
The structure
Very
of
much
English
appreciated.
in China is
So I'm going to
almost
talk about,
identical,
as you can
etc.
see, about
What I have
language
left out
evolution, but
here
actually
is
about
the
the
special
evolution of the
literature,
underpinnings
the
for
force and
language
eighth
rather than
powers of
the
10,
evolution of language
Chinese
itself.
are 10,000.
But let me start by
but
saying a little
apart
bit
from
more
that,
about
in
the
both
man these
languages,
lectures
you can
memorialise.
see I've just
Thomas
put
Henry
in
Huxley,
some blue
affectionately
colouring,
known as
the
Darwin's
sweet
bulldog.
spots, as it were, that is
But
the
he was
numbers
a
that
really remarkable
condense,
character, and I just
a number
remind
like
you of this sort
100 or
of
1,000
outline here
and
that
so
he,
on, into
from
a single
humble origins,
lexeme 10.
became, you know,
So that you can see that in French,
principal scientist of the
Chinese
Victorian
equivalent,
era.
in French this,
He
and
was
and so
an
on,
enlightened
exactly
educationalist
the
who
same.
fought for the
Whereas
education
if you
of
take
women
another,
and
like
working people,
French
he was an
disease,
anatomist who saw the origin of life on the
which seem like
planet
complicated
in
numbers
marine invertebrates.
in French.
He was the first to argue that birds are living dinosaurs, and to see that horses evolved in North America, although they had to be reintroduced by the conquistadores. He was the first to lay out the close anatomical, neurological, and embryonic relations between humans and the other apes. And he correctly realized that Neanderthals were not the missing link between man and ape, but just closely related to modern humans. And in the racist age, he argued for the underlying unity of mankind. So a remarkable chap. And here, let's just go back to when he was a junior assistant surgeon on this ship, the HMS Rattlesnake, on its 4-year trip around the world. And here you see a picture by the ship's draft class of the ship offshore from Russell Island. So where's Russell Island? Russell Island is the red dot that you can see up there. And they sailed out of Sydney, where you just met his wife to be. And this was the first landfall that was made. And they tried to get in through the barrier reef, but failed. As you can see, they went round and round and failed and ended up downstream.
French
But and of course, nevertheless, through telescopes, he observed the inhabitants of Russell Island, and later met up with some Russell Islanders on a canoe, and here is his drawing of a Russell Island canoe, and he was amazed by Melanese's diversity, cultural diversity. So he said, you know, it can hardly have two fashions of canoes in islands scarcely 20 miles apart.
Course,
we
can very rapidly
to this extraordinary cultural diversity. Despite that, throughout his long life, he held to this extraordinary sort of unity of the species, pointing out that the broad and general uniformity that prevails over such an enormous area, exhibiting every diversity of climate and physical condition. Although I have to say, he continued to think of Melanese Oceania as a bit of an exception. So, if he had been able to land on Russell Island, so that's the bottom red dot here, he would have encountered an extraordinary language, which is, as far as we know, unrelated to any other language in the world. It has 90 phonemes, to say you
depending on whether you include
language. These are many unusual sounds encoded there, and one of the remarkable things is the use of nasality. So nasal consonants and things like m, but it has lots of me's
and what's really interesting about
and in addition, it's got prenasalized consonants. These are things like b, and postnasalized consonants, which sounds like and then it has nasal vowels as well. Now, if we just go a couple of hundred miles across the Coral Sea there, we come to another island, Bougainville, where there's another language called Rotakas, studied by Stephen Robinson, which only has 11 basic phonemes, 11 letters to write this language. And it has no nasal consonants, so no m, which is an extraordinary as unusual as Russell Island is in the other direction. So now the point of this is that nasality is made by the V end of your soft palate, and in the case of the Russell Island language, this is doing something like velar gymnastics. It's moving at a 10 millisecond time scale in order to make these sounds, whereas in rotocuss, nothing's happening. And I think that this points to a basic puzzle. You know, the question is, how do you evolve, you know, a precise hardware for an indefinitely variable output? And I think this is a very general problem. So we call it one of the sort of central puzzles in the human sciences, you know, the unity and the diversity, or the diversity and the underlying unity. Nowhere is this more obvious problem when you come to look at languages. So each of these green dots is one of the 7,000 languages in the world,
It's just one
which come from
data point.
some 400 odd maximal groupings of languages where they're related to one to another.
With our ears and
The
then
European
this
language family. But there are 400 and we don't know what
language of Southern Africa,
we just produce a large database of language structures, which covers about a third of the world's languages. And that, I think, shows very clearly that there's surprising variation
because
across
there's less
languages.
pushback
Therefore,
from people
sounds
who
So it's a really
the hill
extraordinary
that they are wanting to die on is the
diversity.
hill of
And I think it's just worth emphasizing the only animal species which has got
outlying borderlands of
So here's the puzzle. You know, you've got at one end, you've got this unity of the species, you know, encapsulating the biology, the genes, and so on. And at the other end, you have this extraordinary behavioral diversity. And the question is, how do we?
Well, I'd like to go a bit
great arc
more.
that must connect.
Sorry, this is like
There must be some positive feedback in both directions. And how, what is it that connects this? And I want to suggest that these theories play a central role, or something we're going to call the interaction. That term. But basically, this is a special species of human social interaction. And the point is that I'm going to argue that this is a kind of machine tool for producing the diversity of languages. So let me say a little bit more about it. So Huxley asks us to imagine ourselves being a Saturnian and looking down on the species, and he claimed it was obvious we were a great in the same way, I think if you look down and thought about human communication, you would say it's obvious.
Very obviously,
what do humans do?
the
They huddle
sounds are
around
different
and they exchange little bursts of communication. First one person
discard
goes
writing
first,
systems.
other
I know
person goes
that
first, back and forth you go.
writing systems is
In
peripheral
the informal
to a
conversation,
language,
that's how
but
it
they
works. And that's
well.
the primary
But
form
if
of
we
human
take them
communication.
together,
Now,
well,
there are a
all
bunch
of
of
these
interesting things
are
about this.
very, very different,
One of them is the
except
timing.
that
These little bursts are 1 to 2 seconds long on average,
very
and
obvious,
they
but
exchange
English,
between
no,
my producing a little burst and you producing a little burst
Russian
back
is
is 200 millisecond gap.
cognate, so that
What is 200 milliseconds? 200
would have been
milliseconds is
the
the minimal
pronounced
human
no
response
when
time.
people
From the
used to say
moment
it
the
that way
gun
in
goes
English,
off and the athlete
and
leaves the block,
palatalized
200
the
milliseconds.
in
will have taken
Russian,
place.
that's a kn,
So it
which
gives you a
is
sense of
way.
the peculiarity of the system.
If we go to that word in
Secondly, humans evolved so
then we've got a little
very
bit
much
shared
of a
inheritance,
performance, a
and there's a
multimodal
little
performance.
bit
When people speak,
horizontal
gesture,
transfer that is
their
borrowing
faces do things,
just in the sign
and
system
body posture and so on also
from
adds to a
Mandarin
little
into
performance.
Japanese.
It's a micro performance in those 1 to 2 seconds. And then there's obviously enough a contingent between one turn and the next turn. So there's question and an answer and so on. Greetings, there might be greetings back. The fourth very important property of the system is that there's not a limited repertoire of signals. Now this is one of course the much celebrated properties of language, that it's combinatorial, so it can produce lots of new messages. But there's more to it
and
than
then
that.
there's
It's partly
all sorts of
due to what I'm going to
types
call sort
of
of
sound
intention
differences.
recognition.
In this
Psychologists
example,
talk about this
only
as theory
Chinese
of
has
mind,
tone
in the
in
sense
this
that I
little
have to have
language
an
sample.
idea that you have a mind,
only Japanese
so that when I say something, you make
accent,
something, you make sense of it.
colorized concepts are
and you
only
imagine
found
what it is that I'm
in
trying.
Russian, the retroflex.
So that's what makes
least
it
in this
possible
word,
to use
only,
some expression like the
only
what's
Mandarin
its
has
name,
retroflection,
where
although
I'm relying on you
Climate also
thinking what it
had
is that I would be
shown
wanting in this case, past the
particular
what's
word.
its name,
So there's
or to
sound
make sense of
differences.
an utterance that's totally vacuous, like a new vaccine will
But
take
there are
some
also
time.
grammatical
True,
differences.
but we
And
interpret
we
it
all know
in a
that
particular
language is
time
basically
scale.
a system for
So
mapping
the evidence
between,
for this forming some kind of infrastructure for language is various, but I will mention just some. So one is that this system is evidenced in infant communication with caretakers long before the infant
that's
knows anything.
where
Often
proponents
called
of
proto-conversation. Also, we've all experienced the possibility of communicating to some limited degree without language when
but
we are
if we
tourists
look
of
at the
foreign
grammar
lands.
of these words for no,
But I think the main argument is simply that if you look across language after language, culture after culture, these
if
problems
we
are
just
constant.
look at the
And they're slight
Russian examples,
wrinkles that we could point to,
those are
but
all
basic
but it doesn't have to be the case that
are
all
constant across culture.
lexicalize that
So I'm going to
as
talk
a verb,
first a little bit about
and
contingency,
kind
then
of
I'll say a
model.
little bit about timing,
actually
and then the
an
other two
agent.
issues will come up as we go
Interesting.
along.
So,
So first let me just
antony
point
pair,
out the
savoir,
contingency in
ignorer,
language.
both
It's actually
verbs
much more
in
complicated
English.
than it first seems.
What's the-
So here you have a little
there's not
exchange
really a verb
that's recorded in an American bar. So Mitch is a
or else
Michelin bottle of beer. So may
we
I have a bottle of
skimming
Mitch?
crossword classes
Are you
there.
21?
In Kaido,
No.
both
No.
are likely.
And how do we understand that? We understand that because there's a question, that's the
want to
first part, and then there's
capture
an answer, that's
the
the
meaning
second part.
through word
But in
class,
between there's
in the
another
translation,
question,
you would say
answer
that
pair.
input means
And
I'd be more
that
inclined to
is
say
a
it
property
means
that
no,
linguists have
but it has to
celebrated
be
as
torrents
center
of
embedding or recursion, this type of recursion.
definitely
And
the
the
reason
point is
I'm
that
going
this
to
is,
just take
the linguists have thought that this is a property of
by the
syntax.
grammar.
But in fact, this
And
is
then
a property
argument
of
structure.
action.
Well,
You see
in
it much more
English and
developed
Russian,
interaction
etc.,
by the
it's a
syntax.
transitive verb.
Anyway, this kind of a system
and the
can be
Noah is
developed
the
so
subject,
that you could
but
put
in
some
Tamil, it's,
first parts and
the
second parts ahead of this,
instead
and
of
then you have
subject
some
verb, there's
after
been a
it.
lot of
So just to sort of
ink
instantiate
spilled
here, you
on
could have
that debate in
A
Dravidian
saying Emily,
linguistics and
she said,
elsewhere,
what?
but at
Did
the
Tom
very
come?
least,
Did
if
he
it
what?
is a subject,
Come?
it's a dative
Yes.
subject.
Oh, good. Yeah, and that
maybe
would
you would
be
just
a little
want to
kind of
say it's
chunk
something.
of conversation. This
So
is a
it
pattern of
means,
structure
something
that you can
like-
find in language after
If you say,
language. In fact,
Kumar knows this
look
place,
in
and something like
detail,
Kumar this place.
informal discourse,
Kumar this place is
dozen
known.
languages, mostly unrelated, and we find
And then the
identical
morphology is also
structures.
different.
So this is something
Chinese,
we're all
is
trading.
a variable word.
Second, let's just turn to timing and turn to
Dialogue.
this is sort of interesting. So, as I pointed out, there's the timing set. Here you can see Anne at the top, Bob at the bottom, and the timing of Bob's turns around Anne's turns. You can see there's a bit of a distribution here. Sometimes he comes in a little early, that's this direction. Sometimes he's a little bit late, so you get a longer gap. But the modal, the most common response is about 200 milliseconds response time. Now, if you look across languages, lo and behold, you get a very similar pattern. It's not identical. There are some languages that are slower, some are a little bit faster. Japanese a little bit faster, for example. And Russell Island there is a little bit faster.
And then the meaning of these words, although we've all lined them all up as no,
interestingly,
as
sign
we do
languages
with
exhibit
nice
exactly the
basic
same
word lists,
kind of timing. And that's
Right,
interesting
rough
because it might be
shod,
the whole point of
semantic
something,
differences,
thing that might
but there are
motivate
some
you.
very
When I
real
speak, it's hard for me to hear.
differences.
But lo and behold,
So we
for
know,
sign languages, when I sign,
that,
I can see
for example,
what you're
savoir
signing
and
back at, simultaneously.
no,
So
and
that's not the motivation
not
for the system.
good translations.
Because the sign looks identical.
Really precise translations. Because in English,
Now, another wrinkle here, which is interesting, is that speech production is a miracle, by the way, but because you need to coordinate 100 muscles to produce
paraphrase,
but
and then in
the
Russian,
process takes some time. the moment anything comes out of your mouth, it's well over half a second. So now what's interesting about that is if you plug this the time, half a second or more, back into this setup where you've got a 200 millisecond turnaround, it's obvious that actually Bob, halfway between while Anne's still talking, probably the last third of Anne's
then as well as that
producing his response, which I think is interesting.
so
not
that
to the end of the same way. There's an overlap of comprehension stuff. Now you could wonder what's the hurry to 200 millisecond rush, and I think that the pressure comes from
so there
the fact that it's and the evidence for this is there is, but one of the ways that proves the James but later when they start to try and put language into the law, so now it's really making twos and bars but it's on the sort of 200 to 400
trying in vain to convince them that
put stuff
Dalibon,
into these little
because you
slots.
might know if
Now it's struggling, and you'll see that they're responding slow. But the point is that there seems to be this inherited expectation of rapid response.
But
now, if
Dalibon
we
Benga,
look
I
at
don't
turn-taking
think really
across the
means
primates,
it really
you'll
is
see
more
that in
like
every
think or
major
having
branch
knowledge,
of the primates,
and the
you
most
will
telling
find
thing about
vocal
it
turn-takers. Now, not all the primates are turn-takers, one has to say, but in every major branch there are some, we're looking at the primitive prosimians, or the New World monkeys, or the Old World monkeys, or the lesser apes. These are all vocal turn-takers. But now you come to the great apes, the orangutans, the gorillas,
actually what I do is in the clause which says that John's outside, I put in a little particle that means, well,
negotiating communication system is largely gesture.
especially if I say Hillary.
But anyway, all of these guys
Hillary knows
however,
John's
recent
outside,
research has shown that the timing of the gesture of great apes has exactly the same 200 milliseconds.
So it really
kind of
focuses on what
expectation
people
for
have in mind
response.
without entailing the fact.
So that makes it all look very similar, and again, like a part of this infrastructure for language. And I point this out partly because it's a very nice sort of behavioural parallel to Huxley's point about this physiological similarity of humans to the other great apes.
Those are just some little initial jabs, the first two shots of the vaccine to get us thinking
now,
about what we're going to do.
recent work, not by myself, but by wonderful paleontologists, geneticists and others, have established that the Neanderthals, so this is a human tree here from down here from Homo erectus all the way up to Darwin. But it's established that Neanderthals have all of the properties for spoken language. So they have the right genes, they have the hyoid bone there that you see, the right sort of vocal apparatus. This is an audiogram, we'll cover all the fossils. And they have the flexible breathing system that is absolutely essential for language. And you may not appreciate this, but every puff of air that I'm producing is
sort of
possible
agree
by
on the
virtue
number
of
of languages.
incredibly
There's
complex
lots of inevitable
innovation of my
about,
breathing system makes it possible to be expressive in this way. So all of this seems to be there in Neanderthals. Now, since it's there in us too, then it's most likely that we can project this down to the common ancestor for Neanderthals and us, which takes us back well over 500,000 years to what's sometimes called Homo against.
Then if you try and make calculations.
So let's assume that this chap had all the ingredients for modern language. But now if we go further back, if we go 1 million years further back to Homo erectus or the African version of Homo ergaster, there's some reason to think that these guys were not vocal, did not have as their primary communication of languages. And that's because they don't have this in large thoracic vertebrate. Here's us, and here's them. And you can see it's a much smaller canal to the
does that make them
thoracic
different?
vertebrae. So we don't seem to have had the breathing
that's a question.
essential
Say a little bit about
human language. But there's every reason to think that during this early time, the kinds of properties that
Then there's another
I'm
question, which
attributing
is
human interaction
maximal
energy
clades,
probably being highly refined.
I find this a useful term, just because when you say
So I'm now
families,
going to think
get
much
hung
more
up
about
on
the sort of
difference
why
between
of
language families and
of
isolates.
the
and I say,
of
there's
the
this 50
evolution of
families
this
and
system.
2 isolates.
And I'm
or something.
particularly
Well, it
interested
really
in this sort of
doesn't
interaction
matter
engine.
if something's an
And I'm going to indulge in
terms
2
of deep
speculations.
level,
Alas, this is a field where we still do a lot of
So the idea of a
speculating.
maximal clade is just
But,
the largest grouping from
and it's
1 up to
essential to point out that the great apes share
1500
much of
of,
this interaction,
for which we can
interaction
secure
system. They're gestural
deposit,
the turn takers, the
about
timing
which
I've
we know
mentioned.
enough to sort of
There's also
prove
they have a contingency of the right kind.
and that sort of number, if we
response.
block a lot,
But it's clear that humans have developed, in particular,
for this,
a very strong sort of inferential mode of communication.
so we think of
I
this
think it's
at current state of knowledge, we presume
this
it's
is
going to go
this,
down.
theory
rather
of
than
mind that I
we might discover a few
And I'm going to argue that 2
Like
mammalian
will
traits
discover
may have been co-opted in
some of these.
evolution
So,
of
for example,
communication.
in a moment.
So one
So,
is
but for
mother
our
infant
current state of
interaction.
knowledge, we assume that each one
Generalized in
is
some very
separate.
peculiar way to out of that
Or better said,
particular
a
relationship
separate
to
development
other
for which we can say something.
adults, and that this could have been
common ancestors.
inferential engine behind language. And the
This is
second
really
argument
important
is
because
spatial
when we settle,
gestural
it's very rare, I think, that in typology,
So let's just take those in turn. So first of all, mother-infant interaction,
That would
and
be
how
shallow.
this may have
you would just have to say,
yielded
for example, all those words that know, that's
generalization
it.
of a theory
So
of
all of
mind.
those other things that I talked about, but
now,
when you do
in order
sample,
to make
so
clear
we're
why
going to
this is
tend to
important,
tell you however
digress
many
for a moment
we
to emphasize
do not
the
want
inferential
over
nature of human communication.
contingencies
So
of the knowns.
language code
That is,
in
you
a
get
combinatorial
transmission
system,
of
that's
traits
what it's
together,
celebrated for.
And you think,
correctly,
oh yeah, this goes with this.
But
Well, the reason it goes with
it
that is that
relies
with that
almost
further back in
entirely
time
on
the ancestral state.
being interpreted.
and
An utterance
that's,
relies on being interpreted in the context of purposes and intentions. Take this little interchange. So A says, I have a 14-year-old son. B says, well, that's all right. A says, I also have a dog. Oh, I have son.
out into the maximum.
This kind of completely opaque, I think it's an opaque little interchange makes total sense when you realize that A is trying to rent an apartment.
And I love this
And suddenly, oh,
quote from
now it makes sense. And this is just an indication of the kind of way in which we rely on inference to make sense of what we say. And so language differs from other animal communication systems, not only in its combinatorial power, but also in its sort of background interpretation. Here, oh, I'm sorry, basically means you're disqualified as a renter. So that's the power of, and in fact, nearly every utterance that we say background is inferential system. So how did this evolve, this intentional stance? How did this evolve? Here's an idea. Well, all mammals have a specially close relationship between mother and infant, just by virtue of lactation. Mothers, of course, have the job of keeping infants happy and well nourished, and so they ascribe wants and needs to the infant, and this is already a kind of rudimentary theory of mind, as it is in special mother-child relationship. Now, it's well known that a critical human trick in the evolution of our species has been alloparenting, as it's called. Basically, outsourcing infant care
do that sort of thing.
Now, chimpanzees can't do this because dad.
So if you say SVO,
and other systems
by S. So nobody
squash it.
which one is it?
And
So people call it yes.
so the
they're
question
not
is,
them.
how do you can
Or
only trust
really
another
trivial
caretaker
problems.
if you
say they're more
if that other caretaker is going to have a similar kind of empathy.
So, but we can sort of enumerate.
But if we can evolve that, then you can have a sort of fitness benefits that are offered by allopathy. And the fitness benefits are very considerable because we are the rabbits, the great apes. We reproduce at double the speed of a chimpanzee, even in our natural state. So now I turn to wondering, what was the mechanism for generalizing empathy?
But there's some problems here.
Across
one of them
adult populations.
found an effect on the choice of
Konrad Lorenz had an
probably used to genetics that settled an island
and he came up with the theory that there is a kind of instinctual response to cuteness. And so big eyes, globulated, small noses, high-pitched vocalization. There's a kind of automatic response, just like his daughter, and probably this
or
is
things that were known at the time
across species thing.
which is not an even playing.
Now, clearly, a cuteness response is going to confer protection against infants. And so,
most
in a hurry to do cuteness properties, it shouldn't grow up too fast. So, this selects for slow development, maximizing care. And now we know a lot more about the proximal mechanisms behind all this than Konrad Lorenz did. So their proximal mechanisms include that cuteness releases the hormone oxytocin, when oxytocin triggers maternal
go
behavior.
across a noun phrase
Signals.
They don't make it into the database because
so here's now, I'm going to now suggest that there's a mechanism generalizing cuteness into the adult population. I might
maps don't do very
to
good.
a theory developed by our efficient
so there was an actual focus on things
1930s. We talked about runaway sexual selection,
subsequent things like
Darwin's nightmare, the peacock's tail. And the argument, I'm just now adapting it for cuteness, goes like this. So if individual X prefers a cute mate Y, then the offspring may inherit both X's cuteness and Y's cuteness.
contemplate.
So you get sort of potential feedback from generation to generation to generation. And this could have then led to
So those were, anyway, that was just some
increasing,
little,
if you like, cuteness specialization.
basically.
Now this is limited in the apes because of the requirements of adult physiology, competition, sexual dimorphism,
Don't agree.
mastication, great joy, big question. But in humans there are additional possible fitness benefits. And one of them is that we just go back to that formula here. Here we have X could be a female preferring a less aggressive male. And that's a story that's often trotted out to explain why the bonobos. The bonobos are the less aggressive, much more friendly, much more social chimp species. X could be a male preferring a younger looking female to maximize fertility. That's a story that has been trotted out by the evolutionary psychologists. X could be a parent preferring a cuter offspring over a less cute offspring. It's a story that I don't talk about very much, but there's some historical evidence for this sort of thing. So offering sort of differential investment. But any of these mechanisms could lead to a sort of potential runaway process with far-reaching effects, including this outgrowth, this spread of empathy and this intentional stance to
And I think it's
other adults
adding that
outside
both
the
from Steve
mother-infant relationship. Now, there's a long-standing observation.
variation
There's a general trend in human beings towards selection of these features. This is often gone under the notion of neoteny, but the mechanisms are actually much more complicated than that. So Stephen J. Gould pointed out that let's talk about heterochrony. So this is the way in which evolution can tinker with the timing of
and in the other corner of the boxing ring,
so you can,
universalists.
so humans, if
I was going to
grow longer legs, but retain, for example,
because Chomsky loves to focus.
So here's a famous photos of a baby chimp next to its mum, and now you'll see here cranium of chimps, and so this is the baby, and there's the mum. And now this is the adult human, and you can see a passing resemblance between the two.
But here are some others.
And so it's not just in anatomy, though, this kind of retention of infantile characteristics. It's true of genes that continue to be expressed in the brain long into adulthood in a way that they're not in apes. We have slowed down child development,
Surprisingly,
culture,
Greenberg, who's a
life expectancy. And then behavioural features. Lorenz himself pointed to the fact that adults retain an interest in play.
had it both ways.
So just going back to oxytocin. So this we've mentioned is involved in the cuteness response, and it's a nice little kind of index for what's going on. So it's upregulated in pregnancy and lactation. It's upregulated in those lower aggression bonobos compared to chimps.
Visiting a massive science of
evolution, and it's associated with social gains.
So these are the two
dose of oxytocin. You can administer oxytocin to experimental subjects, and then they become much more pro-social and cooperative. And if you administer it to people and then give them a communication task,
remember this really
guess what? They're much better at imagining themselves in the other person's position and making sense.
Charles Hockett was one of the great losers of history.
So there's a generalization of sort of empathy from mother to infant relationship, from the mother-infant relationship, and adult may empathy. So in humans, this is really quite an extraordinary thing. So here's Obama crying on hearing of Sandy Hook massacres. We've made whole religions based on empathy. And apes, of course, do seem to grieve on the death of close members of their species, but they certainly don't celebrate others' successes, and they rescue others. From themselves. So this kind of, it is obviously a kind of extraordinary feature of human social life, and it's a very important language. Take this little interchange. Did you hear the terrible news? No, what? You know your Grandpa Bill's brother Dan?
So,
he died?
I don't think anyone's going to argue with this, but nor do they.
How this works, though, is interesting. You know, bad news is best adumbrated. It's a practice that relies on me imagining what you would feel when I came straight out.
Design a tool according to
Grandpa Bill,
what its function is.
Brother Dan has died, so I hesitate to bring this out. You, knowing that I will hesitate to announce that kind of bad news, can guess what I'm hesitating and contemplate about this is how language works, and in general,
envy of some
do not aware
and the question is, who do you get envy?
So now, just to summarize this part of the talk, how did you get your theory right? Through a generalization of mammalian mother instinct to other adults, and cuteness selection could have become a runaway process in humans because of positive selection. Along with that, sort of lower aggression that is.
So as soon as there's a little bit of variation,
what's lowered is sort of reactive hot aggression, not the cold premeditated
friction
aggression.
doesn't
Set up proponents. But possible side effects,
or possible.
neoteny, lengthened childhood, generalized theory of mind and empathy, and this could provide this kind of So when Paul Bremer, the American diplomat, called a news conference, and his first words were, "Ladies and gentlemen, we got it."
Now, of course, a linguistic description could be an idealization.
Slenderest of us. What it actually The second pre-adaptation.
We want to run idealized grammar.
Spatial college potential for language structure. So we mentioned that apes are unusual in having this kind of as their primary flexible communication system, a gestural system. This, of course, suggests that since they're all gesturers, that the common ancestor was a gesturer, and so on up the family tree to our own basal ancestor there.
And then said, yeah, that's for English.
So if we come back to this chap, this is Homo erectus, as imagined by some artists. 1.5 million years ago, he was probably not a fully vocal species.
So then that article of Thomas Perry goes on to
gesture. And so the thesis I'm now going to advance is that gesture may have opened a window for language to draw on spatial cognition. So that's because gesture is a spatial mode of communication, and it's actually largely about space. It's about thinking.
Okay. So there's another concept. One is like demonstration is there.
And today,
but
every
then that
talk
also
is going to be about translates. And in fact, if you try to describe your apartment, house, the layout of that property, you'll find yourself inevitably suggesting possibly, I think, to talk about images around and spatial content
city with
so
original evolution of the
most
most
common
common
bands are in fact quite common. Now this is especially true of hunter-gatherers. So I'm privileged to work with an Aboriginal group.
But so
Queensland
language
and they ongoing use in cardinal directions so they
can just
terminology. It looks like this. So and then from this word you can derive another word and other terms. Now what a little bit interesting about this language is it has no words for left and right. Give up entirely on egocentric
process of power.
They'll talk about them on the desk, or they'll talk north, the left.
So it's very interesting.
It's an extraordinary system. Experiences. Here's a couple talking about things, gesturing, and 1 in 10 words in this language is an north, south, east, west type words, and it's all nearly always accompanied by a gesture for a good reason that these terms give you a 90-degree arc, but the gesture gives the precision
out the window.
And,
the famous sort of intellectual move from Chomsky had his
here's a little digression of language history of linguistics.
Focusing
long been noted
as the sole defining criterion
that there seems some special relationship between language and
something else, and he had this single term salutations
and spatial terms. And so this has been called localism, and it goes right back to the classical Greek, according to Antinomians, and has surfaced sometimes.
Quote here on the right-hand side.
So the reason for this was that people looking at the great classical language,
driven by any selective factors or
Sanskrit and so on, they noticed that the cases, even the words that bind nouns to verbs, which is the core of any language's syntax,
and because
these cases derive typically from a spatial origin.
to show
You
it
see
because it isn't solely
just by analogy to the history of English, old English F, away from being generalized to the genitive of, and then the of playing a critical way role in tying.
Chomsky wrote, surely can't be assumed that every trait is specifically selected. In the case of such systems as language or winds, it's
subsequent
not even easy to
abstraction then
imagine a process of selection that might have
away from space, which we see there.
rudimentary wind, for example, is not
You can see in the English preposition, so
motion
you get
is
going
more
to spatial,
very
giving to sort of quasi-spatial, but changing to
with the
non-spatial, and you see that again and again at the prepositions, generalizing from space to possession in this case.
can't get these things, and of course there's plenty of evolution properties. Just you don't need to have a lot of
So,
stuff. And the
noticing
old
that,
saying
linguists have suggested that
1% of an eye is better than
you could build a
0% of an eye
theory of
if you're a
semantics,
tiny little
that's the
worm
theory
and
of
you
meaning,
want to know where the light is,
where
you're already ahead.
think of all
and you just keep
linguistic items,
making those
words,
small
as having it's being built out of little spatial atoms. And so the
the
kind of spatial
alternative,
atoms
if
you
you
need
take
are
sort of,
things like places and
approach
things in places. You need
course,
paths towards things, away from things, through things, and so on. And then you can have events of things going along paths and so on. And with this kind of little atoms of meaning, as it were, you can build up the meanings of
and just weeks ago, this wonderful book, Symbol came out with MIT Press.
So, what do we know about spatial cognition? Well, a lot, actually, in recent development. So, we know that it's largely located in the hippocampus, which is a limbic structure at the base of the cortex. And two of these structures, the left and the right. In humans, the left one does a lot to do with language, but the right one is clearly dedicated
and
to
adaptive
space.
Or at least not.
And we know through the work of John
they're
O'Keefe
pushing back
here at
this
UCL
very small
and his
incremental
colleagues
skew,
that
all the way back.
that we can find particular cells,
And
individual
that
cells,
leads
that
us
are recording
just
things like the
jumping
places
in a way
where
back in
things are,
time,
directions, and speed and boundary cells. There are all sorts of cells that specialize
what I'll call
for spatial
gradual consumption
located
follows very
in
that languages
and then recorded from directly. Now, there is some kind of very proximate relationship between the cell ontology and the kinds of arguments that we use for description.
each one of those
semantic
assembles
description in general. So there's some plausibility, I think, in spatial concepts. Critical in language, and they may have come from these concepts of important to language. So,
maybe you'll still see a horse.
so one of the evidence that languages
originally developed in the southern end of the Mediterranean and
one of them, so
many other elements,
observed that
all of which will slowly
the hippocampus actually grows when you learn new spatial
places. But if you just when was farming invented? It's not just a single thing. There's a whole. Or you say, well, what about the
grows when they learn their way through London? And in the same way, when you learn a foreign language, your hippocampus grows. And the hippocampus is known to track the reference discourse. And in fact, it can predict the next word that comes. So just in the same way, when you go laughing in the corner, you all of that expect
stuff that
you see something. So when you hear put the key to the door, you turn that, you open the door with the
each package or each
you can predict next word as you go along
places, spatial lines, and this is the same with
So that language invaded the left hippocampus, and the hypothesis that it inevitably picked up spatial concepts, and as a result of this invasion, we may be relatively poor navigators compared to other animals. And of course, many animals have been celebrated for their extraordinary spatial competence. So here's a set of homing pigeons released and then tracked on the horizon, and you can see they're all heading off pretty much in the same direction, a little bit off from home, so they make the serial correction more important. That's part of However, if you take a bunch of northern Europeans out into a forest and take them a couple of kilometers away from their car, they will not point correctly back to the car. So we seem to have lost this native, wonderful
that's
sense
another one.
But of course, we made up for it with a whole technology of spatial reckoning and much celebrated, of course, and also through language and gesture. Because if you go back to those Google Imager speakers who are schooled in the cardinal directions, so they're growing up always having to describe things in terms of north, south, east, and west, they have a mental compass of unerring accuracy. And so if you take them into the forest and try and trick them about where home is, they are not thrown off at all. The same goes for another hunter-gatherer group. Uses a Sahara sample from Namibia, Ikom, and done by a colleague of mine, Daniel Howe, and there's also an overwhelming accuracy.
And English used to have that in yon, and I can have that.
So,
that, and it's actually very common.
So what language has taken away, it's able to give back
with,
by training us up in
so there we've got
direction. Spatial cognition is also involved in perspective taking. So here's a famous task that Piaget did with kids, where he got them to imagine what that doll on the other side of this little arrangement of mountains, what could the doll see?
These are all things which are in principle
and what he found was that kids of 5 or 6
for example,
couldn't really escape an egocentric perspective and couldn't imagine
how you package up
the child.
Let's just take that word for no is independent of what you're doing.
And in fact, it's
pronouns.
It's important to sort of realise that imagining what the other one can see is a first step to imagining what others can think.
So,
and
they're independent.
And in the case of autism, sometimes called mind blindness, a condition is also associated with spatial deficit.
Initially that there were probably...
So spatial cognition, perspective taking, is also involved in what I'm calling theory of mind, this sort of inferential possibility, being able to put yourself
drawing of analogy, and that
actually spatial. So to summarize this part of the talk, gesture may have opened the door to spatial cognition. In turn, spatial cognition seems to have donated a lot of conceptual structure to the language. Language may have invaded the left hippocampus to the detriment of our spatial navigation. It could be a sort of case of this sort of recycling of cortical maps that Standard Hamilton talked about in the case of reading, very interestingly. But spatial cognition also provides a perspective taking. So now, for those of you who are still sort of a bit sceptical about there being a kind of underlying system
and if you look
that
at
makes language
my home continent,
which is not language, but this
there's
kind of
actually
interaction.
no language.
Let me just
None of the
point in
300
two
Australian
directions.
languages
First, there's autism, which I think is extraordinarily interesting condition from this point of view. So, individuals who are on the extreme end anyway of the autistic spectrum tend to exhibit something called mind blindness, anyway, impairment of this ability to pay themselves and other sort of steps. And they have a very distinctive pattern of gaze, which you can see here. This is blue is a normal subject, so kids
grammatical relation
the eyes of the
is one which did not reach the Australian
recognize it down here or indeed
because
down here at the hands and so on.
perfectly good means.
So a different pattern
And we can see lots of other
face-to-face
localized
interaction, and they also have impairments.
for example, as well.
mentioned. But the point is that the impairments that these individuals show are right across the board for the interaction engine. So turn taking is, the timing is odd, the inference of utterance function is problematic, the contingency of terms is often missing, and multimodality, their facial expressions, gestures, and things are all different from normal people. So I think that this is just an evidence that this
one is to show how
interaction engine is some kind of a system.
ambitious every
So that's Exhibit A.
phenomenon.
Exhibit B, I'm not
unusual it is, we need to be able to show
but
how
Exhibit
it
B is this our ability to
which is a much
communicate
bigger
without
job
language.
than just
So
kicking
here,
out a couple
all
of
across the
sentences.
world, you will find individual children who are born into families where there is no
show how
available
they use it.
institutional sign language. And they
Second, we
develop a
need to show
gesture
how the
system
child's mind
all on their own. They'll develop
how the
this.
adults
It's been called home sign.
well, the mind
in
plus your whole
literature. And
articulated
there are some surprising
which is a
similarities
big job.
across such
You're
systems.
doing
Have
it
been
at high speed.
studied with Susan Goldman Meadow, and they're very interesting in themselves. But one of the interesting problems about
How that
it
could
is that
work
they're
for
usually
any one
asymmetric. The system that
vast
the caretakers
range
give back
of
tends to be different.
alternative
So
systems.
you don't end
So
up with
when
a highly
we
conventional
start on that,
system which is shared.
we move language histories back to centre stage.
It's obvious that
instead of saying,
spatial
why do you
concepts of a
stay
sort of
there?
scaffold that makes it possible. He was pointing to places, places associated with people who are like the seats that somebody was justificated in order to indicate a person. And then you've got the back into various kinds of tracing. So using spatial stuff to
And just this
scaffold and
quite at
build
the bottom,
a
I think it's a
system of
useful
systems
metaphor
like this.
that
So
we can think of this
the whole system, of
diversity
course, relies
as being
on the assumption
reconceptualised from
of
noise
there
to
being
thing.
some kind of contingency
just
between what the caretaker does and the infant does
This is where
backwards.
the action is.
And
in
of
terms
course,
what
on
we
this
want to
imaginative
explain and
ability to put yourself in the other guy's footsteps.
So there's a lot of
Take this
approaches
guy,
in linguistics
Baymore.
which revel in
He's
variability. So
a
I've sort of
profoundly deaf individual
already
on
emphasised
Russell
Chomsky
Island.
approach, which is an idealised
People
approach.
sign
There's
with
a lot of
him with
different,
considerable success. He uses different
strands already
systems,
in
though, with
place
different people.
in
I
that field.
noticed
So
that, with his brother,
social
he's using
linguistics,
probably a much more
variations
conventional
approaches,
system than he'll use with people who
all of
he's
his
less
successes,
intimate with.
identify process
But his
variation,
ability to communicate
typically
is
of
extraordinary. Let me just
individual
illustrate.
elements.
So
in speech
this is
communication.
all, of
So
course, in
that's
the
really
interpretation of
helpful
villages
for
around.
looking at
So I take
basically
that
the,
for granted. So here he is
processes by
commenting
which
on a case of alleged
variants get
sorcery,
fixed
which will have caused a woman's cancer.
and what the
And he's
social
pointing to
semiotics
those
of
people over there.
And then grammaticalization studies are
the
really
sorcerers.
important.
And then he is gesturing the anti-sorcery eagle god,
in a whole host
and pointing to the shrine where he inhabits, and then he points over here to show where the god is going to send.
And then a whole lot of cognitive function,
the mountain of the dead. So he's able to communicate these very abstract, complex concepts.
evolutionary approaches. And then Sally Cook on the 20, who delighted is here today.
So I think this is astonishing ability there to communicate without a conventional language, and this is the underlying ability that every child has got to use to acquire its first language, and it does so, of course, in the context of this interactional system. And I think it's not fanciful to see this, which is very foundational for language, and with it, what gives humans
But I still don't think those approaches do enough
accumulated
to confront the full diversity.
So it's a reasonable question, I think. How did it evolve? I posed a question, you may or may not find my account convincing, but I think the question is there. Let me conclude. So Huxley wrote relatively little about language, but in the same year in which he published this famous book, Man's Place in Nature, daring to tread where Darwin didn't, he gave six lectures to working men. And in those, having gone through the same argument that he goes through in the book about the similarities between humans and apes, he turns to the puzzle. What is it then that constitutes and makes man what he is? What is it but his power of language, making every generation somewhat wiser than its predecessor? Goes on to point out that tiny tweaks of physiology
So I'm sure
gender major functional difference. So understanding the evolution of language is going to be difficult because it may depend on structural differences which shall be absolutely inappreciable to us.
correspondence in the days when
of investigation.
letters to each other.
And alas, the same is true today, because I think if there's an elephant in the room for anthropology, it is the evolution of language. Although this is still a domain of speculation, but we have made a lot of progress in paleontology, DNA, archaeology, but we've also got much greater understanding of language, culture, diversity, and role in mind and brain. So we are in a different place. So the speculations are hedged in by science, but I think it's still in the speculative domain. And I have announced or pronounced here some sort of recent speculations, and I think that recognizing this interactional base to language, having a sort of cultural language generator, helps
go
to
back
explain how we can be the only animal with such a diversity of communicative systems. It also makes visible the precursors in the behaviour of the other great apes to our own communication system. And I've suggested that the root to language is elaboration of this thing that underlies interaction. I've produced two speculative developments. One was cuteness selection, how it might have given given us theory of mind, empathy, and this long childhood, of course, is essential, both the acquisition of language and culture. And then the great ape gestural base, one of the spatial representations as templates for grammar. So it remains for me to just acknowledge funders, Max Planck Society, largely in this case the ERC and my own institute, and then generations of colleagues and students who did a lot of this cross-cultural work over the process and then of course the people's rules aided and abetted the structures, field work, and last but not least my wife, Penelope Brown, shown there on the right,
there's some number of principles that
Mexico,
rise to structures. We can't say there's exactly this number, but it's
thank you very much.